I'm talking about the American Jewish Committee. I'm talking about all of the Jewish legacy organizations for the most part. They don't represent Jews. They're doing the bidding of the progressive left. They are much more interested in gender-neutral bathrooms than they are on Israel.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thank you for joining us. Today we have an important conversation about free speech, cancel culture, and anti-Semitism with author and legal expert Thane Rosenbaum for you. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. Also want to make you aware that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. I'm now offering a daily Top Story podcast so that I can share with you more news and analysis about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. Does support for free speech mean that you must support the right of anyone to say anything under any circumstances? Surely not. But under what circumstances is it permissible to enact limits on free expression? Where do we draw the line between free expression and the necessity, as in a democracy, to allow speech that we deplore to be heard, and the need to limit that right when it is used to advocate for violence or the end of democracy itself? And how is it possible for a free society to exist in an era in which most communication is virtual rather than in person? For there to be open forums for debate when so many of us think that opposing views must be suppressed in order for us to feel safe? These are the questions that must be answered if we're to make sense of the debate about Elon Musk's decision to end political censorship on Twitter. And it also should help us make sense of the recent controversies involving people like Kanye West, as well as his meeting with former President Donald Trump. As for Twitter, there's been a lot of plural clutching from the left and partisan advocacy groups like the Anti-Defamation League about Musk's removal of the bans on some of those who were locked out of their accounts by those who ran the social media platform before he purchased it. They seem to be guided by the idea that those who disagree with them about a host of topics, including the right way to deal with the coronavirus pandemic, or what really happened in 2020, and many other topics, should be given the opportunity to voice their opinions, and that it's insufferable to them. Their definition of democracy seems to mean that everyone must agree with them or be silenced. As the late Nat Hentoff memorably put it, their idea of free speech is free speech for me, but not for thee. That's not democracy or free speech. It's just liberal fascism. That's especially true with respect to Twitter, which is, like it or not, the closest thing we now have to a public square where free speech must reign. They liked it on the left when, operating in cahoots with other left-leaning Silicon Valley oligarchs, Twitter's former owners exercised their right as a private company to censor whomever they liked. But now that Twitter is owned by someone like Musk, who believes in free speech, some on the left are calling for government oversight of Twitter. Ominously, White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre, who works for an administration that has spent much of the last 2 years working with big tech companies to shut down the speech of conservatives and other dissenting voices, now says that they are keeping an eye on Twitter. But companies like Twitter and the far larger Facebook, as well as Google and Apple, have far more power than any media or corporation ever had in American history. They own the virtual public square, and it is arguably their obligation, much as in the legal concept of a public carrier, that must not selectively turn away customers to facilitate everyone's freedom of speech, unless it is being used directly to advocate for violence. The virus of cancel culture is deplorable wherever it is found, since shunning and even threatening the livelihoods of those with whom we disagree is incompatible with democracy or any notion of a civil society. It is especially noxious when it is employed by powerful forces working in league with governments to suppress dissent. Indeed, if private companies act to do the will of the state, then what we have for all intents and purposes is a state-run media and internet that is little different from any traditional tyranny. At the same time, it is equally important to point out that just because we believe in free speech and think open forums should not exercise selective and partisan censorship, that doesn't give everyone the right to access to all platforms. That's especially true with respect to those who seek to use their status as celebrities to advocate for anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. That's why those programs that seek to give a person like rapper fashion mogul Kanye West, who now calls himself Ye, or Ye, a platform, should not pretend that giving him an audience for spewing Jew hatred is simply a matter of protecting free speech. West has every right to say whatever he wants, no matter how hateful, provided it is not a direct incitement to violence. But those who platform him should not get away with depicting their decisions as having an open mind about controversial topics, when all they are really doing is gratuitously enabling the spread of hate. That also applies to those who treat such people as respectable voices rather than as extremists who actually have no place in civil society. That's what former President Donald Trump did when he held a public dinner at his Mar-a-Lago resort home with West and the even more repulsive Nick Fuentes, a well-known purveyor of Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. Giving such persons a hearing and the dignity of a reception isn't respecting free speech, it's empowering the forces of hate that he claims to oppose. And given the blind loyalty that he inspires in his followers, which acts in tandem with the blind hatred that his political opponents have for him, what Trump and others who defend West, like Fox News' Tucker Carlson and pundit Candace Owen, has done is not a defense of free expression, but an undeserved boost to hate mongers. To discuss these issues further, I'm very pleased to have with us today one of the most insightful voices on these and other issues involving public discourse and the law. Thane Rosenbaum is a novelist, essayist, law professor, and distinguished university professor at Touro College, the author of numerous books of fiction and nonfiction, as well as a legal analyst for CBS News Radio and the host of programs at the 92nd Street Y in New York City, and the director of Touro's Forum on Life, Culture, and Society. His most recent book is Saving Free Speech from Itself. Thane Rosenbaum, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm happy to be here. I always, when people ask me, what do you do? I say, well, I'm in a very strange business, but I know for sure that when I'm on Top Story, that I always say Jonathan Tobin is actually the best in the business. So it's great to be here with you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm not so sure about that, but thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm very happy to have you on. It's a long-awaited, it's about time we had you on. Thane, I want to start by asking you to talk a bit about the main thesis of your book about free speech and about how and where limits can be permissible. And I think that's sort of more relevant now than even when it was first published in 2020, which unfortunately coincided with the pandemic, and I think it didn't get the audience it deserved. But just give us a little bit about your thesis about that and where we should go from there.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Yes, it's true. The book's publication date was literally 5 days before the country shut down. And an entire book tour was canceled. So, most people don't realize a few things, which is that the United States is actually an outlier among other Western democracies when it comes to free speech, in the sense that for us, generally speaking, which is odd because when you think of the cancel culture and you think of the way in which publishing and mainstream media and certainly universities have shut down speech and shouted down speakers. There's an irony there because technically, legally, we are the most permissive free speech centered country in the world. For instance, France, Germany, Austria, they would never put up for a second with neo-Nazis marching on a community of Holocaust survivors, which happened in 1977 in Skokie, Illinois. Here, the Nazis were represented by Jewish lawyers from the ACLU, and it was considered a triumph of the First Amendment. Everyone said, look at us, look at us. We're going to let neo-Nazis intimidate Holocaust survivors in 1977, which, as you know, Jonathan, is just a few decades after Auschwitz, right? So when you think about how
many more living Holocaust survivors than now.
Yeah, and also most people don't know Skokie at the time, the Nazis knew where they were headed, which was it had the highest percentage of Holocaust survivors in the United States per capita as a small community. And so similarly, a nation like ours that has a history of slavery, allowing cross burning on the homes of African Americans on their lawns, right? Here in the United States, it's considered a triumph of free speech that we would tolerate, that this isn't something that is acceptable in other Western democracies, in part, and I talk about this in the book, because their constitutions, especially Israel's, offers free speech. There are other constitutions throughout Western democracies, but they also require human dignity, right? That's something, the word dignity does not appear in the Constitution. It doesn't appear in the Declaration of Independence. It's interesting. And so the idea of mutual respect, self-respect, what does it mean to be a citizen, right? There's a great line from Lyndon Johnson that I have in the book where I say, a man has a right to go outside his home with his children and not be humiliated. It's a great line. It's true, right? That a man should have a right to do that. What does citizenship mean? It means that I have standing to be here, that it's not about throwing me out, throwing me under a bus, getting rid of me, shouting me down. It's I have a right to be here. And remember, this is in the years before social media. The founding fathers believed in a marketplace of ideas. You know, they believed in a town square where people would get up on a soapbox and make a speech. Why? Well, first of all, it enhances the expression of ideas. It gives people a sense of representative democracy. And there's the hope that the government will make better decisions if more opinions are known. So the book really does two things. On the one hand, it reminds us the importance of a marketplace of ideas that welcomes ideas, not garbage. That's really what this book does that's different. It says that we should feel comfortable in knowing the difference between a good faith expression of ideas and something that's there to threaten, intimidate, deprive people of a sense of belonging and citizenship. And that's, I think, one of the things that made the book different. On the one hand, I stood for the principle of a marketplace of ideas that is open, that open inquiry is very important. But I also talk a little about why should the United States be different than other countries in Western democracies, including Israel, and ignore human dignity. So yes, the marketplace of ideas should be open, but there should be also some idea of mutual respect. You can make an argument about that you don't believe in affirmative action, and you can write an op-ed about that. But burning a cross on the lawn of an African American is not the way to make that point. If you have a problem with something about public policies with respect to Jews or even Israel, you can make that point known without marching into a community of Holocaust survivors and re-traumatizing them. So that's essentially what the book is about. It stands for the principle of free speech, but introduces the idea that speech is not without harm, that speech can be harmful. That's not the same, Jonathan, as insulting speech and offensive speech. Insults and offense is fine. Harm is something else. right? And so when people say you don't believe in offensive speech, that's the difference what's on university campuses with safe spaces and microaggressions. They're saying, in New York Times is probably saying, speech that offends people, that insults them, it shouldn't be free. I disagree with that. I think that speech often offends and insults, but there's a difference between insulting, offending, and causing harm. And by the way, Jonathan, we now have the neuroscience to prove that not just the mental disabilities that are caused by harmful speech, but people get physically sick by being deprived of their dignity and intimidated by someone else's purported ideas.
Well, this is you've laid out, an important problem for our society, because the question is, where do we draw the line, and who is drawing the line? But first, I want to ask you about how social media companies, which, as I think you just acknowledged, really do form the public square that is the main outlet for political speech in contemporary society. Where does Twitter and other social media fit into this framework about speech, in your view?
So it's a fascinating question, and as you know, a modern question. It's a question that only really came up in the last few years because we learned something about the social media companies in the last election that we didn't know. In the 1990s, we didn't know this about them. What we gave them an exemption. It's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. At the time, it seemed like a great idea. What was the idea? Well, the companies that are building the infrastructure of the information highway, the digital highway, this whole new concept of the internet, that we were the people, the contractors that were building this information highway, that they're merely doing is building a highway, that they have no interest at all in what travels on the highway. They're just building the highway. So that we want to give them immunity in order to incentivize them to do a good job and build it faster by saying you will not be sued by what travels on the highway, because we understand that you're neutral about everything. You're just trying to build the bridge, the infrastructure, the highway. And that's why we gave them an immunity. Well, that turned out to be a mistake because we didn't know that the tech companies, but especially the social media companies, had opinions, and their CEOs had particular ideological positions that they thought were acceptable, and some were unacceptable. So the difference between the public square, that the marketplace of ideas that Hamilton and Madison and the other drafters of the Constitution were thinking about when they thought of the First Amendment, they said, no. We want to create a place where people can go and make their voices heard. And if that means that they have to shout, that's fine, but that they have an opportunity to have their voices heard and for people to hear it. And that's what makes citizenship valuable. That's the essence of citizenship, being able to be open to ideas, whether it's expressed by other people or in a newspaper, and that there should be competition for those ideas. Well, it's not easy, as you and I know. It's not easy to build another social media company. Even Donald Trump wasn't able to do it successfully, right? It's very hard to do. So that you do have a monopoly. Twitter and Facebook are monopolies. And the thought that they have no opinions and they're simply introducing ideas into the marketplace. What's different is that in a public square, Jonathan, you show up with your soapbox, you stand on it, and you make a speech. What's very different about social media is it's not just that they can censor the ideas that they don't like. It's worse than that. They have algorithms that create detours to make sure that even if you do have a platform, no one will see it. Right? So if you go to a public square and you shout and you say something interesting, people might run over to your soapbox and go, I'm going to listen to this guy Tobin. He's the best in the business. I want to hear him. But what we learned recently is that through computer science, right? Something that is, not our generation, but through the miracle of algorithms, I can limit the audience. I can curate the ideas that you hear. And if that's an idea that we don't like, we can either censor it, ban it from the platform altogether, which they call deplatforming, or we can rig the algorithm to make sure that it goes to people via Ogden, Utah, that it never shows up on your feed. So that's really the difference, that we gave them an immunity. It was done in good faith. It was based on a principle of neutrality and ideological indifference, that they didn't care. And now we know they care. They care a lot. And that they had an opportunity, and they did affect an election. A very good example was the Hunter Biden laptop, right? I mean, it's a very good example of it was immediately called Russian disinformation. It was banned from Twitter. It was banned from Facebook. You couldn't hear it. It was news, but it was a soapbox that was taken away and was not permitted to be available to somehow influence the minds of voters.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to make. And I think, our audience needs to understand it's not even just a soapbox. The Constitution, the First Amendment, gave anybody the right, as sometimes it was taught to me as a young journalist, freedom of the press means the right of those who own the presses to say whatever they want, which is to say that anybody who had a newspaper could print what they liked. And that was a basic principle of American law and the Constitution. It's changed because social media and the internet companies, Google, Apple, they have enormous power. In fact, far more power than any media mogul of the past. I mean, those of us who grew up with the idea, Citizen Kane, which was, a takeoff on the life of William Randolph Hearst, the media baron. There were other people like him who owned newspapers all around the country and then owned radio stations. But Hearst, Colonel McCormick in Chicago, none of them had anything, could never dream of having the power that Zuckerberg has at Facebook with his billions of users, or even Twitter, which is far smaller with only hundreds of millions of users. So the question I have for you is, what do we do about that? Is it merely getting rid of that section of the Public Communications Decency Act of 1996? Do we use antitrust laws to break them up? There's a lot of debate about this, and both among Republicans and Democrats, because I think people on both sides of the aisle are concerned about it for different reasons, because they all rightly fear that they're about to be censored by their political opponents. Although I think, as you pointed out, it's conservatives who have more to fear from most of the outlets until Elon Musk bought Twitter. What is the answer to this? What is the legal path to reforming this problem?
Well, there are many. One thought, which is something I've been saying for the last year or so, which I think is an unpopular thought, which is to say, let's hold them accountable under the First Amendment. Now, remember, the First Amendment only applies to the government abridging your speech, right? It doesn't mean if Jonathan Tobin all of a sudden didn't like what Thane Rosenbaum has to say and cuts me off, you have not violated my First Amendment rights. This is your show, and you can have me on the show. I'm glad to be here. But if you want me out, you can shut me up, and you could say, I can't believe, I apologize to the audience. We should have never had Thane Rosenbaum, and I do not have any recourse against you. If, however, you were public broadcasting, if you were PBS, now we're talking something else, right? It's got government funding. It's seen as a government entity. Now you've got something else. It's the difference between Colin Kaepernick taking a knee in violation of what the team rules were, and the state of California insisting that everyone in the stadium stand for the national anthem. Kaepernick can get fired. He's an employee. The San Francisco 49ers are not the government. But if the state of California said everyone who's in a football stadium must stand, that's a violation of First Amendment. So one thought is to say, well, we don't have a public square anymore. the public square is dominated by these monopolies. And if we're going to let them function as monopolies, we're going to treat them as if they're providing a public use, right? We're treating them like an airport. We're treating them like a quasi-governmental agency.
So the common carrier doctrine is
brilliant.
Is what you're alluding
exactly.
to.
Treat them like they're providing a public good.
As
and
if
that's
it's FedEx or UPS.
Yes, UPS. We're treating them that they're providing a common good. We recognize that we don't want 100 Facebooks out there, but we're holding them to the standard of the First Amendment, and that they can't shut people up, and that they can't take sides, which is in our legal system is called viewpoint discrimination, right? That the point, it's not just that you give me the right to speak, but the government has to be viewpoint neutral. If there is a restriction on speech, the restriction might be possible as long as it's not viewpoint based. And so Twitter would have been in big trouble because Jack Dorsey was telling you his viewpoint, right? He was telling you what I really think, and he was clearly discriminating on the basis of a viewpoint. So what you said is correct. Public use, common carrier, treat them like a quasi-governmental agency, hold them to the standard of the First Amendment. The second idea is to simply rip away this immunity of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. That should have already been repealed. I don't even understand why we have that. Because again, it was given in understanding that we wanted them to build this thing. It's now built. It's up and running. It's been up and running for many, many years. And we learned something about them, that they are not just contractors. They're also people with opinions.
Yeah, it's more than just a bulletin board, which was the simile used at the time, that it's not a publication. It's just anything. Anybody can post anything there, so you can't hold the owners accountable for it in the way you can to any publisher like JNS. We're liable for what we publish.
Good point.
Whether I write it or whether it's a guest opinion. We're liable for it. If, God forbid it was found to be libelous, we're accountable. But Twitter and Facebook are not, because they have this exemption, and yet they're still acting like I would as an editor, as you said, to selectively determine what I publish.
Exactly. They keep saying, we're not newspapers, we're not magazines, we're a social media company. We're just here to get people to interact socially. We're not a newspaper. Well, what I was saying before about the public square, now that the public square is not where people go, they don't go to the village green to get their information. Now, if they're actually going here, that's the legal argument for why they should be treated under the law as if they're a quasi-governmental agency. And we should stop the nonsense of them believing that they're not in the same position as the press. Because they are in the position of the press, as you pointed out. Many people rely on them much more so than they do on their local newspapers, which, as you and I know, have gone out of business. So
and quite frankly, Facebook and Twitter is where most people access news nowadays.
Exactly.
It's the portal for publications. And that's true for JNS as any other publication. That's where people go. They're more likely to go to their Facebook or Twitter feed, which they can curate themselves and isolate themselves from opposing opinions, than they are to go to the website of a publication.
And another legal matter that could be taken care of through legislation, Jonathan, is restoring the fairness doctrine. Because to me, people, I say this a lot. I say, I grew up in an era where there was three networks, three national networks, major broadcasting networks, ABC, CBS, NBC. There were 200 million, 180 million people lived in the country. 35, 60 million, something watched Walter Cronkite every day from CBS. No one knew if Walter Cronkite was a Democrat or a Republican. Nobody knew what his point of view was, per se, generally speaking, per se. So the concept of the fairness doctrine was, in order to get a license through the Federal Communications Agency, you had to abide by a fairness doctrine, which meant that you were viewpoint neutral, and that on provocative topics you were going to provide a multiplicity of opinion, that you couldn't just provide one. It's not necessarily equal time. That was a different legal concept, but it was a concept that it introduced the idea that you couldn't just provide one point of view, especially on controversial topics. You were to recognize the openness. And I think that eventually was repealed. I think it had a time limit sometime in the late 80s or early 90s, and we haven't had it. So when you look at Fox News, Newsmax on one side, if you look at MSNBC and CNN, the reason those networks were able to take place for two reasons. One, they were cable networks and they were not treated like the major networks through the airwaves. They were like underground. So that was one thing. And the second thing, the fairness doctrine had expired. So they were able to basically, and that goes back to the other point that you said, which is that about Facebook and Twitter and what I said about the algorithm, which is, you know how they make money through advertising. Why is that good? Because there was a time that you'd buy the New York Times and there would be full page ads for Bloomingdale's for watches, especially during Christmas time. I, for one, don't wear an expensive watch. And I used to always wonder, who buys all these watches? Because these are incredibly expensive ads, and it seems all about watches. Well, what Facebook figured out and what they convinced advertisers is we can target the consumer. We know what they like. We listen to them through Echo and through Siri. We overhear them. We see their searches. We know everything about them. And so therefore we target our algorithms that your product will only go to one type of person. And that makes the advertising dollar gold. Because now, instead of taking a full page ad and knowing who the hell's watching this, Facebook is reassuring its companies, we're going to get you to the right person who wants a mattress. That person wants a mattress. And I just think that that's what makes them different from the ordinary press, right? That the press doesn't even do this as well today, even with their digital capacity. They don't do this well. That Facebook literally not only can deplatform you, but can divert the opinion and can direct the opinion to the person that should be hearing it. And that's why we have all these intellectual silos, right? We're separated from differences of opinion because we're watching specific cable networks, and the social media companies know not to send you socialist things. They know what Jonathan Tobin wants to read. They know what he's interested in. And in the old days, these were mysterious, and you would by accident, you'd be running in every day into ideas that you don't agree with. But again, it was a different time where people respected difference of opinion. So that in addition to everything else you and I have just talked about, the culture also mirrored the social media companies. People started to take on the qualities of robots, right? They became closed, that I don't want to hear anything that I don't agree with. And if I don't agree with it, we're not having a disagreement. You are morally wrong. That you are a morally depraved person and you're evil and you're Hitler. As a child of Holocaust survivors, I've been shocked. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but I'm shocked at the casualness which we refer to people as Hitler, or we use the word evil. Today, I know people, Democrats call Republicans evil because they belong to a different party. This also changed in the public. So it really, in my mind, was a perfect storm, what we have. You have the digital technology, you have the immunities of the social media companies, you have them denying that they play a role as a market square, they deny that they are like the press when in fact they are, they deny that they have a viewpoint, they don't acknowledge the way they target the information, they don't acknowledge the truth, that they feed us nicotine. They know where the nicotine is. They give us what we want. And we know that the individuals themselves run to Fox or they run to MSNBC and they don't invite anyone to Shabbat dinner unless they agree with them. And this is a radical departure of what we used to be like as a people. And I can assure you, this much my book talks about. The founding fathers would be appalled.
Yeah, I agree the founding fathers would be appalled. I guess the one, and I agree with almost all of what you just said. I think the only where I might give you some pushback is on the fairness doctrine.
Because I saw that. You had an expression. Tell me
the fairness doctrine also served, as a form of political censorship. I mean, Fox News exists, and Fox News succeeded. I think Charles Krauthammer famously said, great Charles Krauthammer famously said this, that, Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes, succeeded beyond anybody's dreams because they found an underserved niche of the American media market, which happened to consist of half of the American people. When the news was only what four middle-aged white men with moderately liberal views on the three major networks used to say, and we could, Howard J. Smith, Huntley and Brinkley and Walter Cronkite told us what the news was. That certainly made for a more united culture, just as everybody, when there were only three television stations, everybody watched Ed Sullivan. So, we had middlebrow culture where everybody got everything from Topo Gigio, the finger puppet, to opera singers on the same program, along with Elvis and the Beatles. But we can't put, that's not something you can, the toothpaste can't get put back in the tube, not just because, and as much as that has done some damage, it's led to some really toxic, factors in our society. But if we have the fairness doctrine, if the fairness doctrine is applied to every network on cable, then basically we're, who's determining? I mean, whose fairness? I mean, in the end, I think that just leads to more censorship, and that leads to other problems, which it's sort of the law of unintended consequences. But right now, I want to stop for a moment and go back a minute and ask you, how exactly should we determine the criteria between, as you said, offensive speech and hateful or speech that some of us might find hateful, and the sort of speech that you refer to in your book as hate speech and ought to be treated as a hate crime? What's the criteria there, as specifically as you can make it?
Yeah, I know I understand that this continues, everyone in law school, you hear the word slippery slope. To me, slippery slope is, I wish they didn't teach this in law school, because it's always an excuse not to do the right thing. It's always the excuse, you just throw out the word slippery slope and I go, you're right. The idea is, where will it stop? Everyone is afraid of this slippery slope. And when you say the word slippery slope, you are acknowledging there's a problem, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't say there's a slippery slope. So you're saying there's a problem. So the question is, do we do nothing, right? Because we fear the slippery slope, right? Or we do something and try to manage the slippery slope. And I am obviously of the view that we might make mistakes, but doing nothing is unacceptable, right? And that we should find a way to limit the damage of a slope. Maybe we can figure it out, but to do nothing to me is unacceptable. So what I talk about in the book is the line is drawn at the concept of harm. And what is harm? A number of different things. Pervasive attacks on existence, right? Like for instance, as a person, right? To say you should be kicked out of this, you are denied of something. We are treating you as if you don't exist, right? To me, denial is a moral crime. I've always said that Israel has been too soft on the idea of the denied existence of a country. Like this, to me, the Israelis should be much strong. What do you mean I don't exist? You deny my existence? The United Nations says right up front that we're supposed to treat each other with mutual respect. So if you walk in Iran and forget the fact that you want to wipe me off the earth, but the fact that you're even saying I don't exist, you're out. No country is in the United Nations if they're actually saying another country should be thrown out, right? the denial of existence itself is a crime. And so the idea of, Nazis marching on Holocaust survivors, a few things. One, the neuroscience already shows that would re-traumatize a group of people that would be subject to trauma, right? You don't need to be a medical doctor to know that same thing with African Americans burning a cross on their lawn, right? Things that strip away at the notion of human dignity, raise questions of fear and intimidation, right? The concept of feeling intimidated and feeling harmed, right? But the pervasive lack of respect, right? The denial of someone's existence. Towel heads go home, right? Jews should be anything about Jews something should happen to the Jews, right? Those are not in my mind what Alexander Hamilton and James Madison said opinions. Those are not opinions. To deny someone's right to be there, to deny them of their rights of standing in the community as a member in good standing. Those things we have, and I say this in the book, we have misapplied those ideas because the Israelis wouldn't do it, the Germans wouldn't do it, the British, they wouldn't do it. They would never allow what we allow, which I would call speech that's not intended to introduce ideas into the marketplace. They're simply notions of hating another group and wanting them to disappear, right? Which is very, very different from saying, for instance, saying there is a connection between the Quran and Islamic extremism, right? On a campus right now, there would be petitions for Thane Rosenbaum to be fired. There would be petitions for Thane Rosenbaum to be shot. What did he just say? Right? To me, Islam is also a political movement. It's different from the other religions. Muhammad was a general as well as a prophet. It's a political movement. And so to say that there's a connection between the Quran and Islamic extremism is obvious. And the fact that it's not permitted to be said because, quote, someone's feelings got hurt, and Muslims' feelings, or they were offended, right? Perfect examples are the Danish cartoons and the French cartoons, right? Offensive justified everything that Islamists did. And it's like shocking that, as you know, and I talk about this in my book, one of the low points in my mind of publishing is when PEN, the group that's dedicated to human rights, certain writers didn't want to give the Freedom to Write award to the slain cartoonists who were killed by the Islamists from the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists. Because why? Well, because the cartoons offended Muslims, right? And so the mere offense of Muslims itself was a crime. No, offense is something that's, and I talk about this in the book, the Book of Mormon is still a hit on Broadway. I think it's still on Broadway. The very next day, there were ads taken out by the Church of Latter-day Saints that said, "You've seen the musical, now come to the church and see the religion." That's what they said. They didn't.
They were very good sports about it, which was the right way to approach it.
They didn't shoot anybody. They didn't blow. They didn't say death to America, death to cartoonists, death to Jews. This business of that you can always find 40,000 Muslims to shout death to something. To me, this is just, it's the ultimate in racism that we allow a certain group of people the right, the license. If you want to go say death to cartoonists, death to novelists, that you go say death to them instead of saying, not in the 21st century, you don't. We just don't allow that. You've got to find another way. And you've got to also be able to be better sports about a musical or about cartoons about your religion. For the same reason that if you mocked Moses' speech impediment, Jews do not blow things up. That, oh my God, he has a speech impediment. He had a disability. You can't talk about Moses that way. If you could drive through the Bible Belt in this country, Jonathan, and pass billboards with an image of Jesus Christ saying, when I get my next Ford, I always go to, so-and-so's Ford dealership. Evangelicals don't blow things up because of this, right? So you might be a little offended. I didn't really love the Jesus that was selling a Ford pickup truck, but there's a difference, the idea of offense and the insult. And what we created and what we're paying the price for is that we allowed universities to teach this concept that everyone, especially if you're a person of color, can never be offended, can never be insulted, can never be reminded of a bad memory, right? They always must be given the sense of virtue associated with them precisely because of their color. And therefore, if you're white, you're presumptively guilty of something. And so you allowed a number of years of this to happen on campuses. And that's why the New York Times was afraid and had to disavow an op-ed by a United States senator from Arkansas who had an opinion about what to do about the violence emanating from Black Lives Matter that in a university campus would be seen as racist, and why, to me, it was the darkest day in journalism. I already had problems with the New York Times for many, many years, even though I wrote for them at least 25 times over the years. I'm proud of the things I wrote for them, but I'm not proud of them as an institution because they don't deserve it, because they allowed a bunch of kids to show up and decide what is news and what is offensive. And if it's offensive, they start using the word, it endangers the lives of our editors. It's ridiculous. It doesn't endanger anything. They're just opinions you don't like. And that's that newspapers are supposed to be homes for vehicles for opinions that are provocative.
Yeah, I think you're making a very important point, because at a time when so many young people and those on college campuses treat all speech that they disagree with as quote unquote violence and thus worthy of suppression, it's very difficult for us to navigate between the need to police hate mongers and the leftist imperative to silence opposition, which I think dates back to, speaking of something before the internet, but Herbert Marcuse's critique of pure tolerance, which I think helped set the stage for so much intolerance that has followed since the 1960s.
Yeah, and because everyone who listens to Jonathan and reads Jonathan, you're already a more cerebral person to begin with. What Jonathan just said was very important if you want to do your own research. If you want to understand the foundations of Black Lives Matter and critical race theory, you have to go back to Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man. You have to go way back to the Frankfurt School. Go to the Frankfurt School, and then you start to see the origins of what became critical race theory. So anyway, it's just a public service announcement from the Tobin enterprise that he threw out something that many people don't know, but it was an ironic inkling that this it's before the internet and it's before critical race theory. It started earlier.
Well, we're here to educate as well as to entertain. So yes. I don't necessarily recommend Herbert Marcuse for fun reading, but he is an important part of understanding this issue. Let's now, sort of talk about another aspect of this. We've seen in the last 2 years evidence of something I think even more sinister than some of the censorship we've already discussed, which is evidence of coordination between, for instance, the Biden administration and big tech companies to suppress ideas and reporting they regarded as opposition, for example, to their COVID policies. Do you regard developments such as this as particularly sinister and a threat to free speech that really kind of makes libertarians out of a lot of us? Because, the question is, who's the greater threat to free speech now? Is it government, which is presumably always the threat to individual rights, or is it corporations with such enormous power?
Well, Jonathan, you hit on a very important point, and I make this point in my book as well, Saving Free Speech from Itself. That's the title of the book, which is that the founding fathers, they thought free speech in the Bill of Rights, which First Amendment, free speech was an afterthought for them. It's a surprising notion. They threw it in later because a few state constitutions including Pennsylvania, your state, included free speech. The founding fathers were much more interested in the freedom of the press. It's interesting, right? If you ask them what's the most important freedom, they would have said religion and the press, right? It turned out years later, post 1960s, we became free speech obsessed, and free speech cases in the Supreme Court get a lot of attention, right? But from the founding fathers' perspective, free speech was, an afterthought. It showed up later. So what does that tell you? It tells you that they held remember, a lot of the founding fathers were publishers, right? Hamilton had the New York Post, Franklin, right, owned papers. A lot of these guys were publishers. So they actually took very seriously the significance of the media, knowing that there was biases, but it was an opportunity for other newspapers to open up businesses as well. So the concept of the mainstream media being in the pocket of the Democratic Party has been very destructive, because even though you're right about what you said about the fairness doctrine, it was never overt that the government actually had pravda, that the government can rely, like the Soviet Union, on a newspaper, on mainstream media that will tell our story and will protect us if our story is not so good. And that's really what we've seen.
I think the point here is that if the government can get private companies to act to defend themselves and to censor speech on what is the public square, then we don't really need a state-run media. And we don't need a Pravda or an Izvestia, because then they've just contracted it out.
Right, and that's why I'm saying we have the illusion of a free press, but I'm not sure it is a free press. JNS, which you so ably, have been spearheading for years, serves an incredibly important function, because even the Jewish press is usually to the left of center. And so, the fact is that JNS is holding a different set of principles and values and holding the line, because the line keeps shifting left and more progressive. So, yes, you have the illusion of the freedom of the press because there's no state-run press organization, but there's also a recognition that, I remember sitting, I used to be, active with CNN, in not just appearing there, but writing for them. And I remember I got an editor on their op-ed desk to admit to me that we didn't really cover Obama fairly. He actually admitted to me, it's obvious, any honest person knows, that he said, yeah, it's true. We just weren't fair. And we see the way in which the press has protected Joe Biden. It's beyond, having a similar ideological predisposition. It's protecting the man from embarrassment, or protecting him from things that would be unflattering, or things that would suggest something that we don't want you to know. And so that's why, last week when, you appoint a special master, a special counsel on Trump, cases involving Trump, and you don't and you do so because you, as Attorney General Garland said, I do so because Donald Trump has already declared that he's running for president, and I work in the executive branch. So the implication is I shouldn't be in a position of bias because he's running for president. Well, what Garland forgot to say is his boss is also running for president, that Biden also declared that he's going to be running for president. So it seemed to me he should have stood up there and said, I'm here to announce the appointment of two special counsels, one to deal with this guy, one to deal with this guy. I'm getting the hell out of here because I shouldn't be involved in this right now because I don't want it to appear political. And so we don't see that. We see.
I think it's important to point out that former Attorney General William Barr specifically said that he didn't appoint a special counsel on the Hunter Biden case because he assumed that his Democratic successor would do it because that's where the conflict of interest was.
Exactly. Right. Because he'd say, in our case, we're happy to go after him, but there'll be a conflict of interest the next time with a Democratic administration. So, look, it is terribly problematic that you're seeing social media companies and media companies taking positions that are there to, again, call attention to values and positions that they agree with, and to deplatform, shout down, and shut down opinions that they disagree with. And as I said, it's only deepened, it's widened and become accentuated by the culture itself that has become bitter, humorless, and intolerant, right? Humorless, like we can't take a joke. Bitter, we're just angry. That's how we express our political opinions, through gritting our teeth. And a sense of just general intolerance. You never hear anyone, when people say to me, Thane, you seem to write things that sound conservative, but you say you're a liberal Democrat. Well, I am a Democrat, but I'm really a liberal. I'm not a progressive. I'm a liberal. What does that mean? I'm open. I'm open to ideas. I'm not
think we're both 19th century liberals.
Yes, yes.
In the sense what liberal meant, 150 years ago, not in its current political.
Yes, not right. You're right. That's why I said I'm not progressive.
Followers of John Locke, not necessarily followers of Joe Biden.
Yeah, I'm open to ideas, and I'm prepared and very willing to hold different ideas in different hands without melting down. I don't melt down immediately. I always say this to say, when was the last time you had an opinion, that you said something that you thought was controversial, and a person heard what you said and they said the following? In the 19th century, more people would say this. It's funny. I never thought of it that way. I don't really think I agree with it, but I'm willing to take it back with me and sit with it for a few days. I don't think it's going to change my mind, but I appreciate this perspective. Nobody says that anymore. Nobody appreciates a different perspective. Nobody says, let me sit with that for a few. That's what a liberal would do. No hysteria. I'm going to sit with that. It's probably not something I would embrace, but it doesn't mean that you're evil because you said it. And that is a structural change in who we are, the character of our people. As Americans, can't speak for the rest of the world, but this is a radical departure, and it goes to the point that you asked before about the significance of the press becoming essentially a wholly owned, subsidiary of the Biden administration. One of the things that was very tragic about what's happened is when Donald Trump initially used the word fake news. As you know, I'm not a journalist. I write for you guys, but I'm not a qualified journalist. That no one would hire me or think of me as a journalist. I write essays. But as a person who's appeared in newspapers, I squirmed when I heard the word fake news. I thought, this is the end of the world. That is a terrible charge to say, fake news, right? It's a terrible charge. The problem is he's right. He was right. It got worse. He was right. It sounded terrible. And I thought, this is exactly why I didn't vote for Trump. This is exactly the kind of, rhetoric that I was afraid of. But, he turned out to be right. And now fake news is part of our language. But I remember that day when he yelled into the crowd, that's CNN. He pointed to them. And I went, oh my God, this looks like a rally. This could be violent. He's saying those guys are your enemies. Well, the press didn't help it, right? They didn't help it by reinforcing the idea that the news was manufactured. It was being tailored, custom fitted for a particular audience. You know what that's called? Fake news.
Yeah. I think there are a couple of developments here. I mean, we don't have that much time left, but there's still some things I really want to get your opinion on. And I think one of them, and I just mentioned in passing, is labeling things as a misinformation, which is often just means I disagree with it. And that's represented as an attempt to defend democracy, but it's actually, it's the opposite of democracy, just to silence people with different points of views. I'm also very troubled by the way, and this is, the next topic I want to get into, which is how do we deal with anti-Semitism? And part of the problem is that the organization that is most empowered, whose brief is to sort of defend us against anti-Semitism, the Anti-Defamation League, has become, sort of a political player itself.
And I applaud you, Jonathan, because you have had your foot on that accelerator from the beginning on the ADL problem, and no one has stayed with this issue more than you have. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's something I had wanted to mention. It's very rare that a person, in Jonathan's position would take a position that is just very not mainstream the way Jews understand it. They think of the ADL as the ADL of Abe Foxman and before, the ADL that, came out in the aftermath of the Leo Frank lynching.
Yeah.
They see it as a Jewish organization. And Jonathan, you must be commended for sticking with this argument. And you won't let it go. And I admire it. You won't let it go. Look, part of the problem is we have these legacy organizations that have giant war chests that have become enterprises on behalf of the progressive left, that they believe they're bona fides to prove their value. And I'm talking about the American Jewish Committee. I'm talking about all of the Jewish legacy organizations for the most part. They don't represent Jews. It's not clear to me. They have donors and they have boards of directors. I understand. But it's not clear to me they're Jewish organizations. They have the name, they have the imprimatur of Jewish organizations. But they're doing the bidding of the progressive left. They are much more interested in gender-neutral bathrooms than they are on Israel. They're interested in issues that, they're interested in Black Lives Matter. They're not really interested in Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn being beaten up on the street or Jews on the Diamond District beat. They're not really interested in that way. They want to be first in line. And this is why I don't think Chuck Schumer is a Jewish senator. He's a senator, not a Jewish senator. I don't care if he belongs to a synagogue. He's not a Jewish senator for my purposes because he's not standing up for Jews in the way that African American leaders do for African Americans or Hispanic leaders do for Hispanic. Jewish politicians are afraid to stand up for Jews. They're terrified. They would make them very uncool. It's a real problem. We see this. It's true of intellectual Jews, academic Jews. They're not really Jews because what they're interested in is they want to make friends. They want to get invited to the right parties. They want to sit at the right lunch tables. They want tenure. They want to make partner. They want another social circle. And they know, again, this shows an absence of moral clarity and personal integrity. But they know if they shout out, Israel is the worst human rights violator in the history of the world, they're in. And if they say, and I've been to Israel, and I used to love Israel, and I planted trees in Israel,
as a Jew, speaking,
as a Jew, I'm a Jew, but I despise my people. We're terrible people. Can I go to your party now? Will you let me in now? Please let me in now. Now, again, it certainly did not help the Berlin Jews in the 30s, that many of them had received medals in World War I. It didn't matter. In the end, none of this matters. But we've got a problem that we don't have a grassroots movement of Jews that will stand up for Jews and stand up for Israel. We have people in leadership positions, whether they're elected political officials or the heads of Jewish legacy organizations, that believe that their mandate is to prove that they are progressive and woke, that they can prove that they are on the progressive side and that they are critical of Israel. They get something out of that. And then we have this other serious problem, Jonathan, which you are partly there to remedy, is most Jews are just ignorant about these issues. They have no idea. They really don't. They don't know how to defend Israel. If someone says, Israel stole Arab land, most Jews have no comeback to that. It's shocking to me. There's a lot to say. And I know I'm a law professor too. And I know I do this for a living. But I'm shocked that they have nothing to say. They have no idea how to respond. Israel's an apartheid state. I guess they are. They hear that. Well, that sounds pretty, yeah, people are saying that. I hear people saying it must be true. So Jews, grassroots Jews that are just unaffiliated entirely, really just don't know. They don't know what's going on campus. They don't know what's going on in mainstream media's coverage of Israel. They don't know what academics do. They don't know what Jewish academics do in particular, right? Or really, really part of the problem. Jewish academics, Jewish journalists. I always say, I always give him, elevation by saying it's a better career move to be Peter Beinart than Thane Rosenbaum. It's just better. It's a better career move.
Alas.
Alas.
Peter Beinart, the left-wing anti-Zionist.
It's better to be Michael Shaybaum than Thane Rosenbaum. It's just better. Yes. It's just better. And I applaud them for knowing it's a better career move.
Yeah, it's better than being Jonathan Tobin too.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I can say about their Jewish soul. I don't know if it's intact, but I think it's a good career move. So I don't know. The answer is the deck is very terribly stacked because we don't have a critical mass, of the Jonathan Tobins leading the charge, knowing what to say, knowing what is truly anti-Semitic, right? That they don't understand. There's so much that they don't know. Like, for instance, Jews continue to write checks to universities that hate them. I'm an alumnus. Of course I have to write. No, you don't. Stop writing those checks. Stop. What are you doing? And call the president and tell him you're stopping and tell him why. Tell him you've been find out what their Middle East Studies Department says and what it does. You've been reading the tweets. You've been reading the anti-Israel rhetoric, this stuff about the IDF harvesting organs of Palestine. This is nonsense. And this is not what a research institution should be in the business of doing. So if you're never going to see my money again until you clean that up. We just don't have the critical mass of people who care enough or know enough to take principled positions on behalf of the Jewish people. So I'm very skeptical because I only look at, I look at Jonathan Tobin. He's a hero. I go, yeah, he's the guy that won't stop. But there are not enough of him. And I don't know how many people are prepared to get in line behind him.
Well, thanks. That's a very important point. There's one more issue, even though we're going a little overtime here, that I think we can't avoid talking about this week, particularly, because one of the big Jewish stories of this week is the dinner that was held at Mar-a-Lago last week between former President Donald Trump and Kanye West, known as Ye or Yee, and Holocaust denier Nick Fuentes. I think there are some people on the right who are saying it's no big deal. And indeed, which is odd because they spent the previous month crying Gewalt about Kanye West spreading anti-Semitism, whether on social media or on various platforms that he's been given. And now we have a former president who has sort of lent the legitimacy of his presence to a known anti-Semite, a known Holocaust denier. And, we have the predictable political points of view. We're saying, no, we can't go against our side. What's your take on this controversy, and what's our obligation as sort of thinking people who care about the issue of anti-Semitism to react to this?
Jonathan, first of all, I commend your most recent essay to your readers. And for those who are watching Top Story, Jonathan's most recent essay actually picks up on this. And he takes a position that I think is completely correct, which is that it's one thing to say that this dinner means I won't vote for Donald Trump again. That you don't have to say. You don't have to say Donald Trump is now dead to me. He's proven that he has the potential to be an anti-Semite. Yeah, everyone has the potential. Even the grandfather of Jewish children has the potential, especially a guy who has, as we learned from Donald Trump, such a very, very thin skin and such a large ego that he'll go to anyone who loves him. So if they love him, he's willing to step in their direction. If you say, I love you, I'll invite you to dinner. he's not a principled guy. If you love him, he'll show him the love. And so that was always a problem with Trump. But it's one thing to say Trump is dead to me, and it's another thing to say, Mr. President, this is absolutely unacceptable, particularly for the Jews that have been supporting you. For us, the 30% of us, 20, whatever it is, tough sledding in our community. It's tough to do. You may have thought that you deserve more Jewish support, but you actually did get more Jewish support than other Republicans. And it's tough support. And those of us who voted for him, by the way, it wasn't me, but those of us who did, we want to say, we are grateful for everything you've done for Israel. We understand none of this would have happened in a Hillary Clinton administration. We understand that you understand the true intentions of the Palestinians, that you were not fooled like Obama, that you understood what they're really about. They don't seem to want a country after all. They just seem to not want Jews to have a country. You seem to get that concept. So thank you for that. But we are a principled people. And the fact is, we'll still vote for you, but not if this continues. We cannot have you break bread with the Holocaust deniers and enemies of the Jewish people that aren't just disagreeing with us on Jewish policy. They're disagreeing of our existence. They don't believe we belong here in America, that we have standing as citizens. That's something that you cannot embrace. And that when we see that, it only makes us think second thoughts about when we're talking about your association with white supremacy. We don't buy it. We're not scared into it. We reject it. But if you're going to have dinner with Fuentes, you're forcing us to rethink those ideas. And don't do that. We're asking you, don't do that. Be principled. I think the Jews, are so afraid of the Democratic Party on the right and moderate. And they have a reason to be afraid of the Democratic Party, that I can see why Jews wanted to be silent with this dinner. It's only a dinner. Trump is the kind of guy that would do something like this. It doesn't mean that he's, but no, I think that Jews should have taken a Jonathan Tobin position to say, we are not erasing in our minds the affection that you've shown for Israel and your support of the Jewish people. And we also recognize that every time someone says that you're charging us with dual loyalty, that it's nonsense. That we understand what you mean when you say we don't love Israel enough, because we recognize that most American Jews don't love Israel enough. They don't. And so Trump happens to be right. It's absolutely what I said before about most Jews are ignorant about this stuff. They don't know anything about it. So that's what Trump is saying. He's saying, you're making a mistake. You've got this democratic homeland that should be important to you, and you don't seem to think it's important enough to know enough about it to defend it in the public square or at dinner. So the simple answer to your question to everyone, read Jonathan's most recent essay. He takes a very principled position on the Kanye West Fuentes thing, and he takes the correct position that in order to be able to have the intellectual honesty and legitimacy to defend Trump when he deserves to be defended, he must be repudiated when he deserves to be repudiated. And this dinner at Thanksgiving dinner clearly was an insult to Jews and an insult to free thinking people from every party, because clearly, what we saw with Kanye West, you can claim that it's a sign of mental illness, but whatever it is, it shouldn't be encouraged. And inviting someone to dinner that way, it only encourages it.
Yeah, it mainstreamed anti-Semitism in the same way that other outlets that have given him a platform have done, and which Jews condemned across the board. So I think you're right. Thanks for telling people to read my column. I hope they will. Thane, thank you so much for coming on today. We really enjoyed it. We're going to have you back on because there was so much where I didn't even get to all of my questions. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day to Top Story Daily Edition. Whether you're listening to us on Spotify or the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on JNS TV, or on JBS TV, Please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Click on the bell for notifications. Give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org. Tell us where you listen or watch the show and what you think of it. And remember, please keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.